In the heart of what is now Mexico City, beneath layers of concrete and asphalt, lies the ghost of something extraordinary. A metropolis that once held 200,000 people, built entirely on water, destroyed in a matter of months and almost erased from existence. This is not a legend, this is not mythology. This is the documented account of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital that stood on Lake Texcoco, until Spanish forces set it ablaze in 1521, ending one of the most remarkable urban experiments in human history. When the first Spanish scouts reached the valley in 1519, they encountered something their European minds struggled to process. Stretching across the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco was a city larger than any in Spain, connected by causeways that seemed to float on the surface, with pyramids rising higher than the cathedrals back home. The lake itself was not a natural formation in the traditional sense. It was a complex system of interconnected bodies of water, some fresh, some saline, carefully managed through a network of dikes, aqueducts, and canals that would have impressed Roman engineers. The Aztecs had not simply built beside the water, they had built within it, transforming an inhospitable marshland into the foundation of an empire. The city's origins stretched back nearly 2 centuries before the Spanish arrival. According to historical records, the Mexica people, ancestors of the Aztecs, arrived in the Valley of Mexico as wanderers, unwelcome refugees seeking land in a region already densely populated by established city-states. The only territory available to them was an island in the western section of Lake Texcoco, a place so undesirable that no other group claimed it. Yet it was here, on this swampy, snake-infested island, that they founded Tenochtitlan in 1325. What began as a desperate settlement of reed huts evolved, through centuries of innovation and conquest, into the most powerful city in Mesoamerica. By the time Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés and his forces approached in 1519, Tenochtitlan had transformed into a marvel of hydraulic engineering and urban planning. The city covered approximately 13 square kilometers, built on a grid system with canals serving as streets alongside pedestrian walkways. The island had been expanded through a technique called chinampas, artificial islands constructed by weaving reeds together and piling mud and vegetation until solid ground emerged. These floating gardens were not merely decorative, they were the agricultural backbone of the city, producing multiple harvests per year of maize, beans, squash, and flowers. Fresh water flowed into the city through 2 massive aqueducts stretching from springs in the nearby hills, a feat of engineering that ensured the 200,000 inhabitants had access to clean drinking water, despite living surrounded by increasingly saline lake water. The social organization of Tenochtitlan reflected a highly stratified society with the emperor at the apex, followed by nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, artisans, farmers, and enslaved people. The city was divided into 4 main quarters, each subdivided into smaller neighborhoods called calpulli, which functioned as semi-autonomous units with their own temples, schools, and local governance. Markets operated throughout the city, but the Great Market at Tlatelolco in the northern section was described by Spanish observers as larger than any market in Europe, with an estimated 60,000 people conducting trade on busy days. Goods arrived from across the empire and beyond: cacao from the south, turquoise from the north, jaguar pelts from the tropical lowlands, obsidian from nearby volcanic regions. The economic complexity rivaled anything in the Old World. Religious life dominated the city's architecture and daily rhythm. At the center stood the Templo Mayor, the great pyramid dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain, and Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun. This structure rose approximately 60 meters into the air, visible from every corner of the city and from the distant shore. Surrounding it were dozens of smaller temples, palaces, ball courts, and ceremonial platforms, all painted in vibrant reds, whites, and blues, creating a visual spectacle that Spanish soldiers would later describe in letters home with a mixture of awe and horror. Religious ceremonies occurred with precise astronomical timing, marking solar events, agricultural cycles, and military victories. These rituals, some involving practices that deeply disturbed European observers, were integral to Aztec cosmology, a belief system in which the gods required nourishment to maintain the universe's existence. When Cortés and approximately 400 Spanish soldiers, along with several thousand indigenous allies from rival cities, first entered Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, they were received not with arrows, but with hospitality. The emperor, Moctezuma II, chose a strategy of diplomatic engagement rather than immediate confrontation, a decision that historians continue to debate. The Spanish were housed in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's father, and for several months existed in an uneasy coexistence with their hosts. Spanish accounts describe elaborate feasts, tours of the city, exchanges of gifts, and long conversations through interpreters. Yet beneath this veneer of civility, tensions simmered. The Spanish were appalled by Aztec religious practices. The Aztecs were increasingly suspicious of Spanish intentions, particularly as more conquistadors arrived and began melting down gold artifacts sent as diplomatic presents. The fragile peace shattered in May 1520 during Cortés's absence from the city. A massacre occurred at the festival of Tenochtitlan when Spanish soldiers under Pedro de Alvarado attacked unarmed Aztec nobles and priests performing a ceremonial dance in the courtyard of the Templo Mayor. The reasons for this attack remain disputed, some sources claiming the Spanish feared an uprising, others suggesting it was a calculated act to seize control. Regardless of motivation, the result was catastrophic. The city erupted in fury. Thousands of warriors mobilized, trapping the Spanish and their allies inside Axayacatl's palace, cutting off food and water supplies. When Cortés returned with reinforcements, he found himself besieged in the heart of a hostile city, with no clear path to escape. What followed became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. On June 30th, 1520, the Spanish attempted a desperate midnight retreat along the western causeway toward the mainland. They loaded themselves with gold and treasure, weighing down armor already heavy in the summer heat. Aztec warriors detected the movement almost immediately. War canoes swarmed the causeway from both sides. Gaps had been cut in the roadway, forcing the invaders to improvise bridges or swim in full armor. Hundreds drowned in the dark waters of Lake Texcoco, pulled under by the weight of stolen gold. Bodies piled up in the breaches, creating grisly bridges of the fallen. By dawn, more than half the Spanish force was gone, along with thousands of their indigenous allies. The survivors, wounded and exhausted, staggered toward Tlaxcala, a city-state that remained allied with Cortés despite the catastrophic defeat. Yet this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of Tenochtitlan's final chapter. Cortés regrouped in Tlaxcala, and over the following months, a different kind of weapon began its work, one far more devastating than steel or gunpowder. Smallpox, carried inadvertently by one of the Spanish soldiers, spread through the valley. The disease had no precedent in the Americas. Indigenous immune systems had no defense against it. Within weeks, the virus was tearing through Tenochtitlan's densely packed neighborhoods. Estimates suggest that between 25% and 40% of the city's population perished during the epidemic. Among the casualties was the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had led the successful defense against the Spanish retreat. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, inherited an empire already fracturing under biological catastrophe. By December 1520, Cortés had transformed his shattered force into a methodical siege army. In the allied city of Tlaxcala, Spanish carpenters and indigenous laborers worked day and night, constructing 13 brigantines, small warships designed to be disassembled, carried over the mountains, and reassembled on Lake Texcoco. This was unprecedented warfare in the Americas. The Spanish had recognized that Tenochtitlan's greatest strength was its location on the water, with canoes providing mobility and supplies flowing freely across the lake. To strangle the city, they would need to control the lake itself. The siege began in earnest in May 1521. 3 Spanish divisions, each commanding thousands of indigenous warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other city-states, resentful of Aztec dominance, positioned themselves at the 3 main causeways leading into Tenochtitlan. The brigantines launched onto the lake, their sails an alien sight on waters that had known only canoes and reed boats. Almost immediately, the naval advantage became apparent. Aztec war canoes, no matter how numerous, could not withstand coordinated cannon fire from vessels built for European naval combat. Within days, the Spanish controlled the lake, cutting off the city's supply routes and escape paths. Inside Tenochtitlan, Emperor Cuauhtémoc organized a defense that would become legendary for its determination. The city's population, already devastated by smallpox, faced starvation as food supplies dwindled, yet resistance remained fierce. Aztec warriors converted every street into a battleground, every canal into a trap. They dug pits filled with sharpened stakes, covered with mats to look like solid ground. They removed sections of causeways at night, forcing Spanish forces to rebuild them each morning under a hail of arrows and stones. Rooftop warriors hurled projectiles down on advancing soldiers, while swimmers attacked brigantines with fire arrows, attempting to set the wooden vessels ablaze. The Spanish adopted a brutal strategy of systematic demolition. Rather than simply occupy captured neighborhoods, they burned and leveled every building, filling in canals with rubble to create solid ground for cavalry charges. Each day brought incremental progress measured in blocks destroyed and canals filled. Each night, Aztec defenders attempted to reclaim lost ground, rebuilding barricades and launching counterattacks. The fighting was house to house, hand to hand, with no quarter given on either side. Spanish accounts describe streets slick with blood, the air thick with smoke from burning temples and homes. As weeks turned to months, conditions inside Tenochtitlan deteriorated catastrophically. The aqueducts had been cut early in the siege, forcing inhabitants to drink brackish lake water. Disease spread rapidly through cramped quarters, where the wounded and dying lay in the streets. Food became so scarce that people consumed bark, insects, and leather. Bodies accumulated faster than survivors could remove them, creating sanitation conditions that accelerated the spread of illness. Yet still, Cuauhtémoc refused surrender terms, rallying warriors with speeches invoking ancestral glory and divine favor. By early August 1521, the Spanish and their allies controlled 90% of the city. The remaining Aztec defenders and civilian population crowded into Tlatelolco, the northern district, compressed into an area barely 1 square kilometer. Canoes attempted nighttime escapes across the lake, carrying families desperate to reach the mainland. But Spanish brigantines patrolled constantly, intercepting most attempts. The final assault came on August 13th. After 75 days of siege, Spanish forces and their indigenous allies pushed into the last defended quarter. The fighting was apocalyptic. Thousands died in the final hours, combatants and civilians alike, crushed in the desperate press of bodies or cut down as they attempted to flee. Cuauhtémoc tried to escape by canoe with his family and closest advisors, hoping to reach the shore and continue resistance from the countryside. A Spanish brigantine overtook them. Rather than die in combat, the young emperor surrendered, requesting only that his wife and companions be treated with dignity. He was brought before Cortés that evening, and according to multiple accounts, spoke with composure despite his city burning behind him. The fall of Tenochtitlan was complete. A city of 200,000 had been reduced to smoking ruins, its population scattered, dead or enslaved. The lake itself was choked with bodies, the water so contaminated that it would take months to clear. In the aftermath, Spanish authorities debated whether to rebuild on the ruins or establish their colonial capital elsewhere. Cortés argued for rebuilding on the same location, understanding the symbolic and strategic value. Over the following years, the ruins of Tenochtitlan became the foundation of Mexico City. Temples were demolished, and their stones used to construct Catholic churches. Canals were systematically filled in to create streets suitable for wheeled vehicles and horses. The chinampas were abandoned or drained. Within a generation, the waterborne city was transforming into a European-style urban center, the lake slowly shrinking as colonial authorities diverted water and filled in sections for expansion. The destruction of Tenochtitlan represented more than the fall of a single city. It marked the collapse of an entire civilization's political, economic, and cultural framework that had dominated Mesoamerica for nearly a century. The Aztec Triple Alliance, a confederation linking Tenochtitlan with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan, had controlled tribute from over 400 subject communities, stretching from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. This network disintegrated almost overnight. Without the central authority of Tenochtitlan, subject cities ceased paying tribute, former allies shifted allegiances, and the carefully maintained trade routes that had brought wealth flowing into the capital simply ceased to function. The human cost defied precise calculation. Conservative estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 240,000 people perished during the siege itself, from combat, starvation, disease, or a combination of all three. But the demographic catastrophe extended far beyond those 75 days. The smallpox epidemic that preceded the siege continued spreading throughout central Mexico for years afterward, killing millions who had never seen a Spanish soldier. Subsequent waves of measles, typhus, and other old-world diseases struck populations with no immunity, reducing the indigenous population of central Mexico by an estimated 80 to 90% within a century of contact. The fall of Tenochtitlan occurred within this larger context of biological apocalypse that reshaped the entire demographic landscape of the Americas. For the indigenous allies who had fought alongside the Spanish, victory brought unexpected consequences. The Tlaxcalans, whose warriors had formed the majority of the besieging force, expected to assume Tenochtitlan's former position of dominance in the region. Instead, they found themselves subjects of a Spanish colonial administration that viewed all indigenous peoples allied or conquered as inferior populations to be converted, taxed, and controlled. The promises made during the desperate months when Cortés needed their support evaporated as Spanish power consolidated. Some Tlaxcalan nobles received encomiendas, grants of indigenous labor and tribute, but these privileges were minor compared to what Spanish conquistadors awarded themselves. The physical transformation of the site occurred with startling rapidity. Spanish architects and engineers, working with tens of thousands of indigenous laborers, began constructing a new city using the rubble of the old as foundation material. The great Templo Mayor was demolished completely, its stones quarried to build the metropolitan cathedral that would dominate the central plaza. The palaces of Aztec nobility became the sites of Spanish administrative buildings and the homes of conquistador families. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern that followed some of the old Aztec organization, but widened to accommodate horses and wagons. The canals that had served as the city's circulatory system were systematically filled in, transforming waterways into solid streets with underground drainage. Lake Texcoco itself began a slow death that would take centuries to complete. The Chinampas, those ingenious floating gardens that had fed 200,000 people, were abandoned as their creators died or fled. Without constant maintenance, the artificial islands deteriorated. Spanish colonial authorities, unfamiliar with the complex hydraulic systems that had kept fresh and salt water separated, allowed the dikes to fall into disrepair. The careful balance the Aztecs had maintained between different sections of the lake collapsed. Flooding became a chronic problem for the new Mexico City, as the rainy season brought water levels rising into streets and buildings. Rather than restore the indigenous water management systems, colonial engineers began draining the lake, a project that would continue for 400 years until the great body of water that had cradled Tenochtitlan was reduced to a few remnant ponds and canals. The cultural obliteration was equally systematic. Spanish friars, genuinely believing they were saving souls from damnation, launched campaigns to eradicate indigenous religious practices. Codices, the folded bark paper books that contained Aztec history, astronomy, and religious knowledge, were burned by the thousands. Temples throughout the valley were demolished and replaced with churches, often built on the exact foundations of the structures they replaced, a symbolic assertion of Christianity's triumph over what the Spanish viewed as demonic paganism. Indigenous languages, while not banned outright, were discouraged in favor of Spanish. Traditional calendar systems, which had organized Aztec life around precise astronomical observations and religious festivals, were replaced with the Christian calendar. Yet complete erasure proved impossible. The city's indigenous population, though devastated, survived. In the neighborhoods on the outskirts of the Spanish core, indigenous communities maintained elements of their culture in modified forms. Languages persisted, spoken in homes even as Spanish dominated public spaces. Religious practices blended, with indigenous people incorporating Christian saints into frameworks that retained older cosmological understandings. The physical landscape itself preserved memories. Beneath colonial buildings, foundations of Aztec structures remained. Artifacts surfaced continuously during construction projects: stone sculptures, ceramic vessels, obsidian blades, fragments of the world that had been. Some Spanish observers, particularly certain Franciscan and Dominican friars, recognized what was being lost and attempted to preserve knowledge of Aztec civilization. Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades interviewing elderly indigenous people who remembered life before the conquest, compiling his findings into the monumental Florentine Codex, a 12-volume work documenting Aztec culture, language, and history. These preservation efforts were exceptions, viewed with suspicion by colonial authorities, who feared that studying indigenous culture might undermine conversion efforts or inspire resistance. Yet without such work, modern understanding of Tenochtitlan would be limited entirely to Spanish military accounts, written by men who viewed the city primarily as an obstacle to be overcome. The legacy of Tenochtitlan's destruction extends far beyond the 16th century, shaping Mexican identity, urban development, and historical memory in ways that remain visible and contested 5 centuries later. Modern Mexico City, one of the largest metropolitan areas on Earth with over 21 million inhabitants, sits directly atop the ruins of the Aztec capital, creating a unique archaeological situation where past and present exist in perpetual tension. Every subway line excavation, every foundation dug for a new building, every infrastructure project unearths fragments of the city that was burned in 1521. Construction workers routinely discover carved stones, ceramic offerings, skeletal remains, and architectural features that require halting projects, while archaeologists assess the findings. The most dramatic rediscovery occurred in 1978, when electrical company workers, digging near the Metropolitan Cathedral, unearthed a massive circular stone depicting the dismembered goddess Coyolxauhqui. This finding led to the Templo Maya project, a major archaeological excavation that revealed the foundations of the Great Pyramid that had stood at Tenochtitlan's ceremonial center. Archaeologists uncovered multiple construction phases, each successive Aztec emperor having built a larger temple over the previous one, creating a nested structure like Russian dolls. The excavations recovered thousands of artifacts, including sacrificial knives, musical instruments, sculptures of deities, offerings from distant provinces, and the remains of structures that Spanish accounts had described, but that many scholars had dismissed as exaggeration. The site is now a museum, a window into the world that existed before Cortés arrived, located mere meters from the cathedral built with stones quarried from the very pyramid it now interprets. The environmental consequences of Tenochtitlan's destruction and Lake Texcoco's drainage have created chronic problems that Mexico City struggles with today. The city sits on the former lakebed, essentially built on saturated clay and volcanic ash rather than bedrock. As the lake was drained over centuries, the ground began subsiding, sinking unevenly as the water table dropped. Colonial buildings tilt at precarious angles. Modern skyscrapers require foundation pilings driven dozens of meters down to reach stable ground. The Metropolitan Cathedral itself, ironically built with stones from the Templo Maya, has sunk more than 3 meters since construction, requiring constant engineering interventions to prevent collapse. Some neighborhoods sink several centimeters annually, creating a landscape where streets undulate and buildings lean against each other for support. The absence of the lake also eliminated the natural water management system that had prevented flooding for centuries. During the rainy season, water that once would have spread across the lake's broad surface now concentrates in the valley with nowhere to go, overwhelming drainage systems and creating severe flooding in low-lying areas. Conversely, the dry season brings water scarcity, as the aquifer beneath the city is depleted faster than rainfall can replenish it. Mexico City must pump water from increasingly distant sources over mountains and across hundreds of kilometers at enormous energy cost. The city that once had an abundance of fresh water delivered by aqueducts now faces perpetual water stress, a direct consequence of destroying the hydraulic systems the Aztecs had perfected. The cultural legacy remains equally complex and contested. Mexican national identity has struggled with how to incorporate the Aztec past into a narrative that also acknowledges Spanish colonial heritage. After independence from Spain in 1821, exactly 3 centuries after Tenochtitlan's fall, Mexican intellectuals and political leaders increasingly looked to the Aztec Empire as a source of national pride, distinct from European influence. The eagle devouring a serpent on a cactus, the mythological sign that told the Mexica where to found Tenochtitlan, became Mexico's national emblem. Monuments to Cuauhtémoc were erected, portraying him as a heroic defender of the homeland against foreign invasion. Streets, schools, and public institutions were named after Aztec emperors and concepts. Yet this embrace of the indigenous past coexisted with persistent marginalization of living indigenous communities. The Aztec Empire was celebrated as a glorious lost civilization, while the descendants of its people faced discrimination, poverty, and exclusion from political power. This contradiction reflects deeper tensions in how Mexican society has grappled with a history that cannot be neatly divided into heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. The Spanish conquest was undeniably catastrophic for indigenous peoples, yet it was also enabled by other indigenous groups who allied with the invaders against Aztec dominance. The modern Mexican population is largely mestizo, of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, making the story of Tenochtitlan's fall a family tragedy rather than a simple tale of foreign invasion. Recent decades have seen a shift toward more nuanced understanding. Archaeological work has revealed the sophistication of Aztec engineering, agriculture, and urban planning, challenging colonial-era dismissals of indigenous civilizations as primitive. Scholars have examined the siege from multiple perspectives, including those of indigenous allies whose accounts were long ignored in favor of Spanish narratives. There is growing recognition that Tenochtitlan was not destroyed solely by Spanish military superiority, but by a combination of factors including disease, political divisions among Mesoamerican peoples, and catastrophic timing. Had smallpox not decimated the city before the siege, had the Aztec Empire not created so many resentful subject peoples eager to rebel, had Moctezuma responded differently to the initial Spanish arrival, the outcome might have been very different. The question of what was lost remains profound. Tenochtitlan represented an alternative model of urban civilization, one built in harmony with a lacustrine environment rather than in opposition to it. The Chinampas produced food more efficiently than European agricultural methods of the period, yet the knowledge of how to construct and maintain them largely disappeared with the people who created them. The Aztec understanding of astronomy, evident in the precise alignment of temples and the accuracy of their calendar, was dismissed and destroyed before it could be fully documented. Medical knowledge derived from centuries of working with plants native to the Americas was lost when the healers who possessed it died or were forbidden to practice. The libraries of codices that burned represented irreplaceable records of history, science, and culture. Today, visitors to Mexico City can stand in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the square of the three cultures, where Aztec ruins, a Spanish colonial church, and modern apartment buildings coexist in a few hundred square meters. A plaque commemorates the 1521 siege with words that capture the ambiguity. It was neither a triumph nor a defeat, but the painful birth of the mestizo people that is Mexico today. This interpretation attempts to find meaning in catastrophe, to suggest that from the ashes of Tenochtitlan arose something new. Yet, the ruins of the Aztec structures, the foundations of a city that held 200,000 people on a lake, stand as a reminder of what was destroyed. A civilization that developed over centuries, erased in 75 days of siege, and buried beneath the streets of the city that replaced it. The lake is gone, the canals are filled, the pyramids are rubble. But the memory of Tenochtitlan persists, demanding recognition, refusing to be completely forgotten beneath the concrete and chaos of modern Mexico City.